Hey guys, it's Pelican here and welcome to my magsorc ratio guide for the Wrathstone DLC. This patch, the developers have done an excellent job at balancing racial passives, which is why I'm making this video because there's no clear best in slot race for magsorc anymore, and I'm sure that many magsorcs right now have trouble deciding which race to go for. In this video, I'll be going through, in my opinion, the top 3 magsorc races, which is Altmer, Dunmer and Breton. I'll be going through each of their passives in detail, showing you how they may or may not benefit your build and playstyle, and comparing them to one another. All 3 races are equally strong and effective in their own way. It all depends, their effectiveness depends on your playstyle, your build and your situation that you are in. So without further ado, let's get into the video. First up is Breton. Breton seems to be the most favoured Magicka class this patch, not just for magsorc, and it's easy to see why. Out of all 3 races, Breton has the strongest matchup against Magicka players and the most Magicka sustain. The first passive gives you 2k max Magicka, which is very important for magsorc, as stacking max Magicka will not only increase your damage, it will also increase your sustain and your survivability. Many abilities that magsorc use, such as Hardened Ward, Harness Magicka and Pets, only scale off of max Magicka and not spell damage. So many magsorcs, including myself, run little spell damage but a lot of max Magicka. The second passive gives you Magicka recovery and spell resistance that doubles if you have a spell status effect on you. When outnumbered against a group with Magicka players, you will have one of these status effects on you almost all the time. Just to illustrate how much spell resistance this passive can give, the difference in resistance is equivalent to going from 5 light, 1 medium, 1 heavy to 5 heavy, 1 medium, 1 light, giving you a massive advantage against Magicka players. The last passive reduces the cost of your Magicka skills by 7%. The more skills you cast in a given time, the more effective this passive will be, making this passive very useful when you're trying to pass someone down, when you're shield spamming on the defensive, and especially when you are casting Streak multiple times in a row to escape from a larger group. To illustrate, it reduces the cost of Hardened Ward by 245, which means it is effectively giving you almost 500 mag recovery when casting a ward every second. More expensive skills such as Harness Magicka and Mines will benefit even more from this passive. Combined with the 100 Magicka recovery from the second passive, you will have almost no problem sustaining your Magicka. However, Breton also has the weakest matchup against stamina players and the weakest stem sustain. The spell resistance is completely useless against stamina players, and it will create a massive gap between your spell and physical resistance, especially if you are in light armor, making you very tanky against spells but also very squishy against physical attacks. You also do not have any passives that benefit your stem sustain. Going a bit more in depth, if you use Harness Magicka, the Magicka cost reduction will be less effective against stem players because cost reduction is only better than Magicka recovery when you are casting many skills in rapid succession. Chances are, if you are fighting a majority of stamina players, you won't be able to cast a lot because you lack the enormous sustain provided by Harness Magicka. So in that case, getting your sustain from Magicka recovery instead of cost reduction would be better. Besides, there are a lot of passives that amplifies your Magicka recovery. A typical light armor magsorc would have a multiplier of around 60% to their Magicka recovery when buffed, which makes getting sustain from Magicka recovery more effective. So in conclusion, you should consider Breton if you cast a lot of skills, run expensive abilities and want a very strong matchup against Magicka players, and you should consider against it if you lack stem sustain, and also if you do not want a weak matchup against stamina players. Next up is High Elf. High Elf has been the best race for magsorc for a long time, and is still one of the best. High Elf has the strongest matchup against stamina players and the most damage and stem sustain out of the 3 races. The first passive is the same as Breton's, so I won't elaborate on it. The second passive gives you 645 stam when you cast a class skill every 6 seconds. Theoretically, this is equivalent to about 200 stamina recovery, which may seem low, but in reality, it can be much more. Unlike stam recovery, which gets cut off if you are blocking or sprinting, this passive will give you your stamina back without fail, since you will always be casting class abilities, making it very useful if you perform a lot of stamina actions such as blocking and sprinting. When I tried both High Elf and Dunmer, the difference in stam sustain is enormous. To me, the High Elf passive is equivalent to about 2 stamina recovery glyphs. The passive also gives you 5% resistance when channeling a skill, which is very helpful when channeling Dark Conversion or any other skill and summoning your pets. 5% might not seem like much, but it is very noticeable and useful because you are most vulnerable when channeling your abilities, and that is when you are most in need of extra mitigation. The last passive gives you 258 spell damage, which when combined with the 2k max Magicka, gives you a massive increase in damage, allowing you to drop some spell damage for extra Magicka recovery. However, High Elf does not have as strong of a matchup against Magicka players as Breton and Dunmer, as it lacks resistance to spells. But this is not an issue at all, because if you are in light armor and you are using Harness Magicka, you already have a very strong matchup against Magicka players, so you won't need any extra spell resistance. In conclusion, you should consider High Elf if you are running channeled abilities, if you block and sprint a lot, and if you want the best matchup against stamina players, and consider against it if you feel like you are struggling more against Magicka players. Lastly, we have Dunmer. With the race changes this patch, Dunmer has become a strong contender as a race for magsorc. Dharma can be seen as a balance between Breton and High Elf. The first passive gives you 1875 max Magicka, which is slightly less than that of Breton or High Elf, but it's a negligible difference so it doesn't really matter. It also gives you the same amount of max stam, which is very useful if you feel that your build lacks in max stamina. For example, you may feel that running Tri-Step Fruit gives you too much max stamina, but not running it results in too little. So going Dunmer will be a good way to balance that value out. But do be aware that the opposite effect may happen, where having Dunmer for your build results in too much max stamina, but not having Dunmer results in too little. So know your max stamina preference well and plan ahead to ensure that you achieve your optimal max stam. The preference of max stam differs from person to person. Some magsorcs do fine with as little as 12k stamina, while others may prefer as much as 20k, it all depends on their playstyle. The second passive gives you 2.3k flame resistance and an immunity to the burning status effects, which gives you a good advantage against Magicka DKs, which are one of the hardest counters to magsorc, and is also very useful for vampires as vampires take more flame damage. Flame damage is also the most common spell damage type, so having resistance against it will always benefit you. The burning status effect is also usually underestimated, as many people think that it does not contribute much to your damage taken. But since flame damage is so common, the effect will have a rather high uptime, and the damage over time from it can hit very hard due to the Dragon Knight's combustion passive. So having immunity against burning can remove a lot of pressure from you. The last passive is the same as the High Elf passive, except it also gives weapon damage. So it can come in handy should you choose to switch to a Stamina Sorcerer without race changing. So in conclusion, you should consider Dunmer if you want a strong matchup against Mag DKs, if you plan on going Vampire, if you need more max stam for your build, or if you just want a balance between Breton's superior matchup against Magicka players and Altmer's stam sustain and better matchup against stam players. As mentioned before, all three races are strong and effective in their own ways, and there's no clear winner on which is the best race. Which race will suit you better will depend on your playstyle, your build, and the fights that you get into. The advantages or disadvantages that one race has over the other can be offset to an extent by swapping your gear setup around. For example, a Breton with 2 spell damage glyphs has around the same damage and Magicka sustain as a High Elf with 2 Magicka recovery glyphs. If you are still new to magsorc and you are not very experienced with your playstyle and build yet, I recommend not race changing until you are certain that changing to the other race will benefit you. Conveniently, each of the 3 races are also in different default alliances. So if you are creating a magsorc, you can choose your race based on your alliance preference, because the overall difference in effectiveness between each of the 3 races is small. But as for my personal preference, I chose to go High Elf because my playstyle involves using a lot of stam, as I often dodge roll to mitigate damage and avoid bursts, and I sprint a lot to escape large groups, and I also block a lot both for animation cancelling and to mitigate bursts. I also run a pet that tends to die when outnumbered, and I cast Dark Conversion often, so the 5% mitigation while channeling skills helps me a lot. I also tend to meet more stamina than Magicka players, and I struggle more against them since I cannot spam harness to give me infinite sustain when I'm fighting lots of stam players. And I've always preferred Magicka Recovery over cost reduction for my Magicka sustain. Besides, I feel that if I'm ever in a situation where I am taking so much damage that I have to spam cast Harden and Harness non-stop, my main issue wouldn't be my max sustain, but it will be my stamina sustain, because I would need a lot of stam sustain to be able to dodge through all the damage and kite the people to a better location. So that's all for the guide video. I hope that it has given you more insight into the racial passives and help you better decide on a race for your magsorc. And do leave a comment if you have any questions, and I'll see you in the next video.